Section 6.2, trigonometry of right triangles. The trigonometric ratios, or trig ratios, are sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So we have to talk about an angle. Let's call this angle A. We'll just use this theta. That's the usual symbol. So if this is the angle that we're talking about, the first thing you need to identify is the hypotenuse, which is across from the right angle. Once you have that, you can identify which one's across from the angle that we're talking about. That side's called the opposite side. And then next to the angle, we call that the adjacent side. So then if you have heard before, if you've heard of SOHCAHTOA, that's just a quick little thing to help you remember sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So sine opposite hypotenuse. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. Cosine adjacent hypotenuse. And then tangent opposite over adjacent. TOA, tangent is opposite over adjacent. So let's do a quick example here where we write the trig ratios. Let's call this side, say that's 3, this is 4, and 5. And let's talk about this angle. So sine of this angle, theta, that's what that letter is called, that symbol. So once you have the angle, I like to label the hypotenuse, the adjacent side, and the opposite side. So sine is, you gotta remember SOHCAHTOA. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so 3 over 5. Cosine, adjacent over hypotenuse, 4 over 5. And tangent is opposite over adjacent, 3 over 4. And with these, you will sometimes be asked to do the cosecant, secant, and cotangent, which you just have to remember cosecant is the reciprocal of sine, it's the inverse of sine. So that would be 5 over 3 instead. Secant's the reciprocal of cosine, so that would be 5 over 4. And then cotangent's the reciprocal of tangent, so that would be 4 over 3. So if you wanted to try to figure out how many degrees that angle is, you can use your calculator. If you're trying to find degrees, make sure your calculator's in degrees, so go into mode, make sure you're in degrees. And since we know we can do any of these, sine, cosine, or tangent, but if you're trying to go in reverse and you want to know what the angle is, you do this sine -1. Then input the fraction, 3 over 5. And we get 36.87 degrees. So this angle is 36.87 degrees. Whenever a problem says to solve the right triangle, that means you need to be able to give all three angles and all three sides. In order to do that, you have to have a right angle, and then at least one side and one angle, or you could have two sides and solve it from that. So in this case, we have an angle of 30 degrees and one side of 3 square root of 3. So we can find everything else because we can use sine, cosine, or tangent. So first, since we have so in this case, we have the angle on 3 square root of 3, which is adjacent. So we're going to need to take one of these sides, one of the ratios that uses adjacent, like either cosine or tangent, to find the other two sides. Also, you should know that the three angles add to be 180, so if this is 90 and 30, that means this one has to be 60, because it has to add to be 180 degrees. So now using the 30 degrees that we have, we can use cosine of that 30 degrees. So we know that cosine has to be adjacent over hypotenuse. That's the ratio. It could be 3 square root of 3 over the hypotenuse. And then we can solve that by finding the cosine of 30. Make sure you're in degrees before you enter cosine of 30. And then we have to cross multiply. Since we're trying to solve for h, we're really going to end up doing 3 square root of 3 divided by cosine of 30. So 3 square root of 3 divided by cosine of 30. And we get 6. So the hypotenuse is 6. Then to find the other side, since we have 2, you could either do Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, or we can just use one of the other ratios, sine or tangent, because both of those involve the opposite side, which we're trying to solve for. So let's go ahead and use sine this time. So sine of 30 equals opposite over hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is 6. So similar to what we did for cosine, we're going to solve this. But to solve for opposite, now we're going to be multiplying sine of 30 times 6. And we get 3. So the opposite side, the length of 3.